This is the third screencast about the history and globalization of English. It is going to be about Middle English, and it will cover the period from 1100 to 1500. So the change into Middle English begins with an event called the Norman Conquest in 1066. Basically what happened is that a nobleman called William the Conqueror from Normandy in France invaded Britain and defeated the Anglo-Saxons. The Normans were actually related to the Vikings, a group of Vikings which had settled in France around 200 years earlier. And we can see that because the word Norman actually looks a little like Norseman, Norman. They spoke a version of French called Anglo-Norman, which was quite different from the French that was spoken in Paris. So after the Norman Conquest, when all of England had been taken over by this group of people coming from France, several languages were used. There was the Anglo-Norman version of French, but that was only the language of the king and the nobility. So it was actually only a spoken language. Latin was used as the written language by the elite and by the church and by the official administration, but farmers and even lower classes of people continued to speak English, or the version of English that they had at the time, around 95% of the population. Over time, though, this changed because Normans and Anglo-Saxons started mixing and intermarrying. So the languages started sort of blending together. This mix of Old English and Anglo-Norman is what is called Middle English. And around 10,000 Norman words entered English, many of which are still used today. For example, words related to crown, nobility, castle, prince, so on. Words related to government and administration, like parliament. Words related to court and law, like justice, but also related to war and control, army, battle, servant, and words related to art and fashion and literature, like money and language and beauty. So this was the language of the ruling class. These are not words for like basic everyday things. Sometimes, if both Old English and French versions of words with the same meaning survived, there would still be small differences. For example, the French words would seem a little more sophisticated, maybe. Infant instead of child, forest instead of wood, battle instead of fight, liberty instead of freedom. So why didn't all English people just like start speaking French? Well, around 85% of the old Anglo-Saxon words were lost because of the Viking and Norman invasions. Still, though, English ended up as the language of England. For example, because not everyone spoke French or Latin, but everyone spoke English. Also, during the Middle Ages, the 100 Years' War against France, where all of a sudden French was the language that was spoken by the enemy. Oh, we don't want to speak that. and also the Black Death, the plague. This horrible disease killed around 1/3 of the population in Britain. But it hit the Latin-speaking clergy, church people, very hard. And the English-speaking classes, such as the workers and traders, started to grow in importance, meaning that English didn't die out. So in 1399, Henry IV was the first king since the Norman Conquest to have English as his mother tongue. And that's what this map shows too, is the spread of the Black Death and how it hit England in 1348 and again in 1349 and again hitting Scotland in 1350, spread all over Europe. So Middle English texts start to be written in the 13th century instead of French or Latin. The most well-known example is a text called the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, which he began writing in the 1380s. And it was seen as proof that English can legitimately be an artistic language, a poetic language. He did have many loan words from French, around 20 to 25% of Chaucer's vocabulary. However, English had become a language of its own again. A changed one, of course, but still a language of its own. And Chaucer is the first to use many new words, for example, difficulty, significance, ignorant, words that haven't shown up in earlier texts. And what's weird is that change is happening so quickly at this time that there are many different forms of the same word that Chaucer uses quite inconsistently in different manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales. For example, sight, 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 sigh, and sight all mean the same thing, but spelled in different ways. So there was no standard for spelling yet. Also, John Wycliffe in 1384 produces his English translation of the Bible. This is important because Latin was seen as the language of God. So he was challenging that, and it was sort of a revolution against the church. So of course this translation was banned, but it continued to circulate, spread sort of underground. And Wycliffe introduces new words or phrases here with this translation. For example, this expression that is quite common, an eye for an eye, comes from John Wycliffe's Bible. So overall, the language has changed a lot, and a lot of the words and so on from Chaucer's time would probably not have been understood by people speaking Old English. So to sum up, important events for the development of Middle English: the Norman conquest, the invasion of Britain by this people from northern France, meaning that several languages were spoken in England at this time. But English started to sort of see a return due to Alfred the Great, but also the beginning of real English literature, like Chaucer and John Wycliffe's Bible, making English legitimate language also in literature and poetry.